This is probably my favorite place that we chat about. I really get the chance to talk about some of my favorite years in history here. That was a ghost, knocked you right over. Yeah. I get to chat about the 1920s and 30s here, and I love that period in time. I wish I had been around back then. You know, we had such fun back in those days. Now, during the 20s and 30s, this place here was home to Judge Carlisle Espy, hence the name of this house, the Espy House. Now, Judge Espy was a Supreme Court judge on the Georgia State Supreme Court. Who remembers what was going on legally during the 1920s and early 30s?
Prohibition.
A bit? Thank you very much. Prohibition, yes. So all alcohol was illegal. So Judge Espy's big to-do was throwing bootleggers in jail. Anybody who was involved in the illegal sale or transportation of alcohol was to be off the streets and behind bars. But that was a little hypocritical of Judge Espy, to be smacking down his gavel on these naughty bootleggers. Because what do you think Judge Espy was doing when he was not behind the bench? Judge Espy was a bootlegger. He ran one of the largest and most successful bootlegging rings in the whole Southeast. This guy just knew how to eliminate the competition. And he did a very good job of doing it. Judge Espy was a very wealthy man from all this illegal bootlegging. But he led a double life, and people didn't know about it. On the one hand, he was this very well-respected, prominent judge and political figure. On the other hand, he was certainly this very prominent criminal. But he was smart. I mean, he knew any whisper of these illegal dealings would have destroyed his professional career. So he kept it all nice and quiet. He didn't even tell his wife and his family where the wealth was coming from. But as hard as we try to cover things up, things will always boil to the surface, won't they? Especially for somebody as important as Judge Espy. Now, fortunately, Mrs. Espy, his wife, had to hear about her husband's illegal dealings from her friends, not from her husband. Mrs. Espy had the misfortune of hearing her friends gossip as they talked about what her husband was really doing behind everyone's backs. That really stung. For a proud woman like Mrs. Espy, this came as quite the blow. But here she was, one of these high society Savannah ladies, one of the most important hostesses in town. She doesn't even know the man she's married to. Her husband has been lying to her for all these years, living this double life without even the decency to tell her or let even her know. And she was just devastated, crushed. Understandably, Judge and Mrs. Espy's marriage took a turn for the worse. Now, the kinds of people that they were, the social positions the Espys held, their marriage might have been over, but they were not going to get a divorce. That was out of the question. At the time, that was unheard of for somebody like Judge and Mrs. Espy. And they might have hated each other's guts, but they were going to keep up appearances. And they did. They stayed living in this house, outwardly trying to pretend as though everything was just perfect. Judge and Mrs. Espy had a son, a guy named Wesley Espy. Say that 5 times fast. Now, Wesley believes his father was this morally upright guy. I mean, wouldn't you? Your dad's a judge. But of course, Wesley is mistaken. Wesley has a daughter, a 6-year-old girl named Catherine Espy. As anyone would do with grandchildren, Wesley used to bring Catherine over here to hang out with her grandparents. Now, one afternoon, in the early 1930s, Catherine was over here visiting her grandparents, and Judge and Mrs. Espy got into one of their more notorious fights. Yelling, screaming, swearing, throwing things at one another in this front parlor right here. And Catherine comes into the room to try and get her grandparents to stop their fight. I mean, she's there to have a good time. She's not there to listen to her grandparents yell and argue. She's just a little girl. But Judge and Mrs. Espy are so wrapped up in their arguing, they don't even realize their granddaughter has walked into the room to try and entreat them to stop their fight. They don't even know that Catherine is standing feet away from them. And at one point, in a fit of rage and fury, Judge Espy shoves his wife backwards away from him, and she falls. She trips on a coffee table behind her. The marble top from this coffee table slides off and hits Catherine in the head and crushes and kills the little girl. The Espys don't even know they've just killed their own granddaughter. Totally oblivious. It's not until the household servants were tidying up this parlor 12 hours later that they even found Catherine's body crushed beneath this marble slab. Understandably, Catherine's father is devastated. And Wesley's beside himself with grief. Here, his father is not this morally upright man, and it's cost him the life of his daughter. Wesley's ready to throw his life away. He decides he has nothing more to live for. He starts drinking heavily, hangs out in the speakeasies, keeps company with gangsters, prostitutes, gamblers. He really wallows in all this dark sin and degradation that his father has perpetuated for years. But eventually Wesley finds the trouble that he's been looking for. Because pretty soon this rumor gets started that Wesley is sleeping around with the girlfriend of one of the members of this Irish gang called the Hars Brothers. Now, the Hars Brothers were a rough, tough gang of Irish bootleggers here in Savannah. They used to run booze from here in town out to Tybee Island. Lucrative enough for them. But of course, these guys were amateurs. They were small-time crooks. They answered to Judge Espie. That made the Hars Brothers dangerous and reckless. These guys wanted to prove themselves. They wanted to make a name for themselves. They thought making an example of Wesley might do just that. They couldn't have Wesley trifling around with one of their girls, now could they? So one afternoon, one of the Hars Brothers went to see Judge Espie in person at his offices. He said, "Listen, you tell your spoiled little son Wesley to keep his hands off my girl, because if he doesn't, there will be some trouble, and he will pay." Nobody ever knows what Judge Espie did with that information. It seems like Judge Espie did nothing. It seems like the judge just didn't want to involve himself in a sticky situation that might have jeopardized his business. So he just turned a blind eye, whatever the consequences for his son were. One very, very cold December morning of 1933, a car came squealing around this corner and stopped right here in front of this house. And there was a little boy nicknamed Sleepy, who was eyewitness to everything that happened here that morning. Sleepy had been delivering coal to all the houses along Calhoun Square, and he was just about to deliver a load of coal right here to the Espies when suddenly this car squeals up and two men jump out of the front. Members of the Hars Brothers gang. They took a look at Sleepy and they said, "Get out of here, kid, beat it, you got no business being here." So Sleepy ran around and he hid behind this corner of the house and he watched what happened. These two men popped the trunk of the car. They dragged from the trunk the bruised, beaten, bloody body of Wesley Espie, face beaten to a bloody pulp. You can scarcely recognize who it is. Rope dangling from his neck, suit torn to shreds, soaked in blood. They drag Wesley's body up onto the sidewalk and they tie him up onto this railing here, blood dripping down these steps. The two men hop back in the car and they squeal off. While Sleepy comes out of hiding, runs up the stairs, bangs the door, and he gets the attention of the Espies. They quickly drag their son indoors. Judge Espie doesn't want to call the police, though. No, heaven forbid the authorities get involved. But they are going to need a doctor. They can't treat Wesley's wounds all on their own. Tucked ever so carefully into the breast pocket of Wesley's jacket were Wesley's severed private parts. These men had made quite good on their debt after all. It's complimentary, we don't charge for that. Now, the thing is that Judge Espie didn't want a local doctor to treat Wesley. No, because everybody here in Savannah knows everybody. Somebody would have talked. You just can't have scandal. So instead, Judge Espie sent for a doctor all the way up in Baltimore. It took this doctor 3 days to get to Savannah. By the time the doctor arrived, Wesley had been lying out in this front parlor, losing blood at an alarming rate. There was nothing the doctor could do. He just watched Wesley die. This might have been a crime scene, a murder scene no less. But not so in 1933 for Judge Espie. The next day, Judge Espie went down to the newspaper and he signed over a rather large check. He made sure that rather than the truth, that week the newspaper would print a story that said, "Fall from balcony proves fatal for Wesley Espie." People didn't really buy that, though. I mean, people might not have known the whole story, but that was really too big of a pill for everyone to swallow. So Judge and Mrs. Espie were branded murderers. That was it. They were done, finished. No one wanted anything more to do with them. They moved to Atlanta, never showed themselves here ever again. That was the end of their story here. It seems like this whole set of tragedies changed this house forever. It seems like what happened here in the early days cast a shadow over this house which was never lifted. Later, the Methodist Church, that place right there, bought this house and turned it into apartments. 7 separate apartments in this great big house. They're renting them out. And at one point, not too long ago, in 1996, a man was renting one of the apartments here, and he'd recently had his daughter taken away from him by United Way. A social services lady had come by this house, taken the man's daughter from him, and put the girl into a foster home. He didn't like that too much. So when this United Way lady showed up here again, this guy shot her dead on these front steps. A third tragic death to have happened here, and another weird death that involved the stairs. Now, years after that, in 2002, a girl moved down from North Carolina to attend the Savannah College of Art and Design. Now, she was offered a very big scholarship, a scholarship anyone would be jealous of. She couldn't wait. She was going to move down here to Savannah, rent one of these apartments here downtown in this beautiful house, go to SCAD, pursue her dreams. Everything seemed just peachy. I'm going to move around this corner here. I'm going to point out the bedroom that was hers and explain to you what happened the first and last night she was ever in Savannah. she didn't know that. This was just a great, big, beautiful house to her. So, it was her first night here, all alone, no roommates, getting everything unpacked into her new bedroom. All the while, there was a huge storm raging here in Savannah. Thunder, lightning, torrential downpour. The last thing she saw clearly was a bolt of lightning come down and hit something outside of the window, setting up a shower of blue sparks. Oh, then out, pitch black inside and outside, dark as far as the eye could see. Now, she had no candles, no emergency lights, no sense fumbling around in the dark, but she told herself she'd just get some rest, and in the morning, in daylight, when she could sleep, finish her unpacking, and that would be that. So she crawled into bed, and after a long, busy day, she went to drift right off to sleep. But about halfway between being awake and being asleep, she was startled by a sound, which she said sounded like shoes scraping across sand, coming closer and closer and closer to where she was there in her bed. This really frightened her. Startled her. She looked around, tried to see what this thing was. She was all alone. Surely there was no one else in there with her. So she shrugged it off and told herself she just wasn't used to the sounds of the new house yet. That was all. So she laid back down and, again, began to drift right off to sleep. Again, about halfway between being awake and asleep, she heard another sound. Now, this time, she said it sounded like fabric brushing against cardboard, meandering its way through the boxes in her bedroom, coming closer and closer to where she was in her little bed. And this startled her. She sat up, bolt upright, looked around, wide-eyed, tried to see what it was. Nothing. She was indeed alone. So this time, a little unnerved, she told herself it was her overactive imagination getting the better of her. That was it. Just leave it be in the morning, everything will be all right. She laid back down, but not but a minute later. She hadn't even had time to drift off. She heard a third sound. This time, she said it sounded too much like heavy breathing, getting heavier and heavier, raspier and raspier, coming ever closer to where she was there in her bed. She went to pull herself up once and for all. Before she could even hoist herself up out of bed, something which she could never see there in the darkness suddenly pounced on top of her, was digging into her, forced her body back down into the bed. It felt as though there were hands over her throat, over her mouth. She couldn't breathe. She was in terrible, excruciating pain. She couldn't see it, but she could feel some other body pressing down against hers there in the darkness. Her bones and joints began to crack and pop beneath the weight of whatever this thing was. After it felt like forever, she said the sheets began to twist and entwine around her body, as though whatever this thing was were wrapping her up, reeling her in. And after what felt like an eternity, she managed to wriggle free. She made it to the doorway. She screamed out into the dark, stormy night, dear God, somebody, please help me." And in that instant, whatever it was, just let her go. She hadn't the courage to turn behind her and face it. She ran straight out of this house, several blocks away through the stormy night, made it to her friend's house, the only other person she knew here in Savannah. And she stayed with that friend for the rest of the night. Certainly, I do not know how much she slept. But in the morning, she came back here, loaded up her car with everything she had. She drove clear back home to North Carolina. She didn't stay here in Savannah, didn't go to SCAD, didn't accept her scholarship, and she sure as hell never spent another night in this house. They called it a skinwalker. Goes by all sorts of names. But according to Gullah legend, during the daylight hours, the hag will assume the form of a human being. Woe unto us. As often as a human being is capable of morale, sometimes the least suspected person, someone ever so close. But at night, they say the hag will strip itself of its human skin, reveal itself as it truly is, just a human-like mass of muscles and veins, take hold of us, and drain the life and energy right out of us. But what if you go to bed with not a lot of energy? What if you go to bed depressed or mad or sad, or maybe you're just mentally and emotionally and physically exhausted? The hag doesn't discriminate. It'll take whatever else it is to have on tap. It'll drain you dry, leave you with nothing. And then when your lifeless corpse is lying there, the hag will strip you of your skin, wear it, and masquerade itself as you until it finds its next victim. And as incredible as this girl's experience with the hag might sound, this is something the Gullah people believe in wholeheartedly, and have believed in wholeheartedly for hundreds of years. So the hag has been around a lot longer than any of us. Let's remember that. But from Savannah up to Charleston, the whole low country is just littered with stories like this. Perhaps it is too common. Here in Savannah alone, this is one of dozens, if not hundreds, of similar tales. I could devote a whole tour taking you to houses where there have been reported hag attacks. We'd be out here to the wee hours of the morning. This is one of many. So certainly do take that to heart. Because we just don't know, do we, if where we're staying tonight is somewhere where such things have also happened. So keep that in mind in this fall. Enough tomfoolery and superstition. They decided it was time to put somebody sensible in here, somebody who knew what they were doing. The Methodists turned this place into their new parsonage. So the Methodist minister moved in here, all by his lonesome, no family. First night in this house, the minister said he heard what sounded like someone treading on the carpet outside of his bedroom door. So he went to investigate, swung open the door, stepped bravely out into the hallway. Standing right in front of him was this strange figure of a man. This man, he said, was dressed in a tattered, bloody, ripped-up suit with a rope dangling around his neck. The minister said this man had scars and lacerations across his face, as though he'd been cut up or beaten up. This man looked the minister right in the eye and spoke, but said only 2 words. He said to the minister, "Be just." That was it. That was all. And this man, whoever he was, held a finger up to his lips as if in silence, gave the minister one last penetrating glance, and then turned on his heel, walked down the hallway, and just disappeared. This happened every single night the minister was here. It happened so often the minister actually moved out. I don't know if anyone here is Methodist, but this congregation here, they tend to hold the belief that there is one ghost, that is the Holy Ghost. Do not go running around believing in other ghosts, because that's just superstition, and we don't do that. So it seems pretty weird, doesn't it, that the Methodist minister couldn't even stay in his own damn parsonage because of things that were too unexplainable, too weird. Without even knowing it, the minister seems to have given a dead-on accurate description of Wesley Espie. What's Wesley still doing here, though? What's this "be just" that Wesley says? A lot of people think it's a warning. A lot of people think Wesley's saying, be just, lead a just life, or terrible things will happen to you, just as happened to my family. Maybe. So if that's true, what in the world was the minister ever doing? Now, the Methodist Church still owns this place. They use this bottom level here as their offices, only during the daytime, though. But the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floors remain totally and completely unused. Since the minister moved out 5 years ago, not a living soul has spent the night inside this house. They have brought 6 different construction companies in to try and renovate. Not one has stayed. Every last one says, tools go missing, accidents happen, people get hurt on the job. That's one thing or another, but people just do not stay here. I'm not really surprised. And there are a number of presences that we believe inhabit this house. One for sure is Wesley. But also, people have claimed to have heard a little girl laughing inside. Sadly, that might be Catherine Espie, 6 years old, perhaps still here. Recently, people say they've seen a woman wearing a white dress walking along this back balcony at night. The United Way lady, the social services worker who was shot in 1996, she was wearing a white dress when she was killed. But for sure, the most malevolent presence in this house, whatever it is what attacked the girl that night up in this bedroom here. And on a final note, the girl's grandmother didn't say. A hag, she said, is something like a spider. She said it'll cast its web and lay in wait, rarely ever leaving its feeding ground. But it doesn't have to go far to get what it wants. Because we rarely know when we're about to fall prey to a hag until it's much, much too late. So do keep that in mind. I said before, and I will say now, truth here in Savannah is a whole lot stranger than any fiction. I hope you will take my word for that and not have to find out on your own.